Beneath the crimson sweep of the desert sky, he told her, "I'll bring you the moon. Darling, wait for me." His voice carried like wind through canyon stone, soft, eternal, and false. She believed him. Because love, in those wild days, was a sacred promise, rare as rain, fragile as dawn. When the cowboy rode away, the stars dimmed above the mesas, and the night swallowed her hope whole. Now, years later, they say her spirit still wades by the riverbed, where moonlight meets memory, and promises turn to dust. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Under the bleeding sunset of the frontier, Tala gathered river reeds with hands that knew the patient rhythm of the land and felt, at first, only the ordinary weight of evening until the sound of hooves loosened the air like a sudden promise. Jesse Cole rode up the bank as if he belonged to every road that ever ended in dust, his coat carrying the smell of smoke in distant towns, his face a map of regrets sketched thin by wind, and when he tipped his hat the small shadow it threw seemed to make the world hold its breath. He wasn't the sort to shout or swagger. There was a quiet about him, the kind that suggested doors closed behind him long ago. Yet his voice, when it came low and close, had the softened grain of someone who'd learned to keep certain storms to himself. And when he said, "I'll bring you the moon, darling, wait for me," the words landed like a coin on a palm and glittered with a light Tala had almost forgotten to need. She believed him, because belief in that place made miracles of the ordinary. Rain after drought, a child born in winter, a promise kept longer than a single season, because his eyes, for all their desert-worn sorrow, looked at her as if she were not a thing to be protected but a thing to be seen. And being seen in those years was a rare and sacred thing. Around them the canyon sighed, birds threaded their last calls through the canyon's ribs and the river stitched a silver seam through the valley, and the scene felt, for an instant, like the space before a deep and certain change. Jesse did small, human things that made her trust him more, the way he eased his horse instead of spurring it past, the slow deftness with which he mended a torn saddle strap on her offer of a blanket, the clumsy tenderness of his attempt to learn her name in the old language, which he said like a prayer and not like a novelty. Tala's world was braided tight with duty, songs to remember, hands to heal, nights where elders listened for the news of the world beyond their mesas. But in Jesse she found a different kind of map, one that promised motion instead of route, and that promise stirred something within her that had been hushed into quiet by years of survival. Yet even as the moon rose and their shadows met on the sand, a fine tremor threaded the promise. Because promises, like tracks in the dust, are marked by the feet that make them and the storms that follow. And Jesse carried the scent of other camps, other fires, and rumors keep their own steadiness out here. Men who do not keep oaths, men whose words are as quick as their boots are fast. Still, Talia held the crescent of that vow in the hollow of her palm and let it warm her fingers. She let the small myth of his words bend the night toward hope. When he rode away the next dawn, because men like him move like seasons, never fixed, he left behind a pendant of intention, the shape of a moon carved from a spent bullet, small and absurd and honest, slipped into her hair like a seed. She watched until a silhouette stitched itself to the horizon and the air filled with a slow ache of absence. And in the hush the canyon seemed to swallow the rest of the world's certainty. That night, as she sat where river light pulled and the moon climbed its slow arc, Talia repeated his promise aloud until the syllables fit like stones into the hollow in her chest. The stars watched without speaking, and the land, ancient, patient, and unforgiving, kept its own counsel, waiting to see whether the vow would change the shape of either of their futures or whether it would break, as so many desert promises do, into the clean, unavoidable dust of what happens when a man rides away. The village watched him with a slow suspicion of people who have survived by reading weather in the bend of a branch. Jesse moved among them like a man who had learned to be useful because usefulness buys a kind of forgiveness. He mended a broken wagon wheel with hands that smelled of leather and gunpowder. He helped haul game from a bad hunt. He traded a length of rope for a basket of dried corn. And in small, steady ways he stitched himself into the pattern of days until some of the elders nodded and some of the children reached out for the fringe of his coat as if testing a new kind of sky. Tali watched all of this with the careful heart of someone who knows the shape of a promised thing before it is spoken aloud. She watched how he slept with one hand on the saddle horn and how he kept his back to the fire so his scars faced the light. She watched the way the men at the trading post spat when he walked by and the way the women pretended not to notice his hand brushing a child's hair. Her laughter, rare, clear, and quick as a sparrow's call, became for him what the river was to a parched canyon, life returning to a place that had gone dry. He learned the names of the elders' horses. He learned to weave a crude braid into a girl's hair, and he tried to answer the quiet questions the tribe asked without speaking them. Where do you come from? What have you done? Who do you owe? But wounds, especially the ones a man tries to ride away from, have a way of catching up with him in footprints and in the way a stranger's eyes follow him across a field. Rumors moved faster than the river, soldiers who burned villages, a deserter who left his own Michaelusember, the sort of talk that settles into the tinder of a people who remember loss. No good comes from loving a man without roots, whispered some, their voices thin with memory and warning, and their words wrapped around Tala like a winter shawl. She heard them and felt the friction of two histories at once, the Apache memory of raids and promises broken by treaties, and Jesse's own map of flight from a life that had demanded he choose a side and left him hollow when he refused. Still, the world of duties and the small, stubborn human world of affection do not always consent to each other's timing. Tala's hands were busy with the lineage of her people, teaching younger girls how to read the clouds for rain, learning the old songs into which grief and joy are braided, tending her mother's fevered nights, and yet her nights opened to Jesse as if a second moon had risen. Soft light on a riverbank where they would trade stories that were not boastful but honest. Confessions dropped like stones into slow water. He taught her how to sight a gun, only so she could understand the sound of a shot, and she taught him how to braid willow for traps and how to say the name of the stars as if naming them might make them kinder. In those exchanges, two worlds found a language, not the brittle diplomacy of treaties, but the blood-level barter of hands and eyes. The elders watched this, and some hardened like clay left too long in the sun. Their caution was not cruelty but memory, of promises made by traitors and soldiers and then collected by sorrow. And so they tightened their lips and watched for the moment when the moon-shaped pendant in Tala's hair might be a sign of a bond that would break them. Tala felt the pressure like a current under a boat. She felt the way her own people's trust leaned on her shoulders, how her choices could tilt the village toward peace or peril. Yet love, when it blooms in a place that knows hunger and grief, refuses the neat boundaries of counsel. It is messy and stubborn and makes itself sacred by the mere fact of existing. Tali loved, quietly, fiercely, and for a time that love built something between her and Jesse that gleamed like a promise. But in the corners, where shadows gather and rumor breathes, would speak louder. He tried to smile, but it came out as a shadow. There was nothing left in him but the will to make this one last stand mean something more than survival. The first shot cracked the air, splitting the stillness into fragments. Jesse's hand found the rifle's pulling. The day his troop burned a village until smoke braided with the morning, the lieutenant's orders given like a sermon. The way the faces in the huts went from questions to ash in a time so short it made his hands tremble even now. And in that trembling he remembered the moment he turned his horse away because his throat would not shape the command to fire, and the shame of leaving the others to whatever came after. He had run then with the same raw, animal need that kept him moving now, a shadow of a man who kept walking to keep from looking back. And the desert had been his confessor and his punishment ever since. The secret sat in his saddle like a dead thing, heavy, smelling faintly of smoke and old leather. And every morning when he woke with Tala's laughter still soft in the corner of his mind, the truth was a stone he had to swallow whole, pretending it was a coin while his stomach knotted around it. He loved her with a kind of fierce, clumsy reverence, and when their hands met by the river he felt something like absolution, but it was always edged with terror. Forgiveness is a fragile thing, easier to hold when it is given as a gift than when it is the price of someone else's ruin. He watched her sometimes as she moved through the village, mending, teaching, listening with the patience of a river, and the sight of her made him want to confess to the bones of the story, to lay the whole blackness blind on the table and ask her to hold it. But he knew the shape of the danger. Truth, once let out like a hawk from a fist, can circle and peck until the heart is blind. In his sleep he dreamed of the ash falling like snow on children who had been laughing that morning, and he woke with the taste of those children's names on his tongue though he had no right to know them. And each time Tala spoke to him in her language, soft syllables like water over stone, He felt the gulf of his silence yawning wider. The desert is honest in its own way. It does not keep secrets kindly. It preserves them by burying them in sand until the bones beneath demand daylight. Jesse spent his days performing small remonstrances against the man he had been. He fixed splintered posts at the corral with careful, deliberate hands. He carried water in the heat without complaint. He taught lads to write who would not challenge his past, and he kept his gun clean, though he promised himself he would not use it unless he had to. These were acts of contrition in a world that seldom accepts apology online and paper. He rehearsed the confession in the dark, how he would say it, how he would watch her face when the words arrived. Yet every rehearsal ended with his throat closing like a trap. He loved Tally enough to want to set his past between them like a third, shared thing that both could touch and learn from. But he loved her more in the coward's way, the way that shelters by leaving, the way that keeps the worst of a story hidden so those you love can breathe. At times he suspected even this love was selfish, an attempt to bathe his hands in water by holding someone purer to them than he felt he deserved. And that suspicion bit like cold. The elders' glances, the rumor threatened talk of the trading post, the small, habitual spats of distrust from neighbors. These were the outward signs of a danger he carried inside. But the real peril was quieter. The tremor in Tala's eyes when she caught him staring at a smoke-warped horizon. The way her fingers lingered a heartbeat too long on the crescent pendant he had given her, as if holding an anchor for both of them. He imagined the day he would tell her, the way the river would reflect his shadow as he spoke, the way the moon might be a witness and not a lie, and he imagined it ending with her turning away, not in anger but with the slow, broken dignity of someone who had been promised more than the world would keep. Until then he rode under the same sky that had watched the burning, carrying a small, private ruin in his chest, learning to be useful to those who would take him without knowing the price paid for his presence, and praying in a language he had never learned that silence could, somehow, be the thing that saved them both. They learned the river's secret hours together, the thin, honest calm before moonrise when water takes on the color of old silver and the world seems to breathe slower. And in those hours Tala let the past unclench around her long enough to laugh at small things, and Jesse let the desert empty of its heavy guilt enough to answer with stories that began far away and always ended with a small, honest regret. They traded names for constellations. He taught her the fiddler's tune from a town he'd left behind. She taught him the song for rain that her grandmother pulled from the bones of weather, and all of it threaded into nights that felt like sutures, stitching two lives together against the wide, indifferent sky. Jesse worked with a new kind of reverence. He saved the shiny brass of a spent cartridge and, by lamplight, began to file and bend until it yielded a crescent, rough-edged, but somehow true. Then he smoothed it with the heel of his hand and gave it to Tala like a small confession, tucking it into her hair where it caught moonlight and looked, for a moment, less like metal and more like a promise made sacred. She took it as if taking the world's mercy. She threaded her fingers through as in the gesture was a kind of treaty that neither tribe nor law could name. And in that treaty they built a world that kept, for a while, the louder histories at bay. But the land remembers everything, and the sky leaks news like rain. Smoke rose one night on the far rim of the mesa, a pale, thin column that seemed at first only a trick of heat, then a troublous signal, and the mood of the camp changed as if a breeze had carried a new note through a song. Sharp, sudden. The cavalry came like a rumor made flesh, horses pounding the earth with the impatient rhythm of a demand. Men in uniform with collars stiff as ration books spoke in clipped orders, and their leader, an officer whose jaw was more a rule than a face, looked at the river as if at a map of sins to be corrected. They were hunting deserters, which is to say they were hunting men who had tried to choose conscience over command and found themselves unprotected by either law or mercy. Jesse's name, which had been a secret he tried to wear like a second skin, traveled on the wind and landed in the cavalry's ears with the bluntness of a charge. Tala saw them first, torches scattering like angry moths across the far plain, and felt the color drain out of the world the way a tide takes the shore. Even before the men reached the corral, the elders' faces had folded into counsel and caution, and whispers shaped themselves into plans whose edges were fear. For Jesse, the arrival was a stone dropped into still water, rings outward, unavoidable. The men he'd fled would not be reasoned with, and his past preferred to find him with a rifle and a ledger. He moved with quiet efficiency, hiding saddles, speaking short words to those who would listen, giving a measured account of where he had been and where he meant to go, because he had learned that confession does not always buy mercy. only time. Tali watched him carry the burden with the same stubborn dignity he wore when he refused to burn what his orders had told him to burn years ago. She wanted to speak for him, to step forward and say, "This man saved children once, but the world does not often change its verdict at the insistence of a lover." The moon that had been their witness that very night seemed to hang closer, as if leaning in to hear what would be decided. Its face, silver and indifferent, watched the small human tragedy unfold. Plans were whispered. Jesse should leave tonight, cross the Badlands, find work where no one knew a deserter's name, or he should stand and fight, and the tribe would either side with him or be broken by the law's hammer. Between those two choices, a harder truth, duty versus heart, split Tala like a bird caught on cloth. The wind changed direction and carried with it a new smell, leaden leather and the iron of imminent choice, and as riders tightened their circle, the river's calm was gone. Under that sudden, battering sky, the world they'd sewn together held in its seams the threat of being torn apart, and in the quiet before action, Tala lifted the crescent from her hair, pressing it to her lips like a prayer, while Jesse, who had promised the moon and now faced the men who might take him for it, felt the full weight of what promises cost when the land itself insists on payment. Colonel Samuel Briggs arrived not with thunder, but with the kind of stillness that empties a room before he even speaks. His men dismounted like shadows trained to move without noise, their boots pressing order into the dirt, their rifles glinting with the indifference of purpose. And when Briggs raised his hand, the desert seemed to listen, as if even the wind obeyed the weight of his will. He was a man carved by discipline and disappointment, a relic of campaigns fought for causes that dissolve faster than whiskey at dawn. And the years had stripped him of softness until only bone and duty remained. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, like the underside of a lizard's belly, and when he looked at the settlement, he didn't see people, only potential accomplices in the crime of mercy. The settlers gathered under his gaze like cattle before a branding fire, answering his questions with the kind of silence that hides fear behind usefulness. They had seen men like Jesse before, drifters, deserters, dreamers, and they knew that siding with one meant inheriting his ghosts, so they offered only blank stares and trembling politeness. Briggs dismounted slow, his coat brushing the dust as he turned toward the blacksmith's porch, and when he spoke his voice was dry and tight, a rasp sharpened by command. "The name's Cole. Jesse Cole. Seen them?" The silence that followed was almost a sound of its own. The smith's hammer froze mid-swing. The preacher's hand faltered on his Bible. A child's laugh died somewhere near the well. No one answered, but the colonel didn't need answers to know when truth was being swallowed. He smiled, not out of joy, but habit, and that small, ghostly curl of his lip was worse than anger. His men spread through the camp, turning over barrels, opening doors, rifling through the small lives of people who had already learned to live on the edge of the government's mercy. That night, the stars were swallowed by smoke from the campfires of soldiers who waited with the patience of men used to hunting both men and conscience, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Jesse lay awake beside the riverbed, his hand around the pistol he swore not to use, while Tala sat near her mother's tent, her heart split clean in two like wood under a dull axe. She had heard through whispers the Traber's nervous talk, the tight-mouthed warnings of old women, that a colonel was riding through the territory asking questions about a deserter who spared an Apache village long ago. The moment she heard it, her body went still as if bracing for a storm that had already begun. That night, she found Jesse near the willows, his face a blur of worry in moonlight. She didn't speak his name, not at first, only knelt beside him and touched the edge of his sleeve where dust and memory clung like a second skin. "They're coming," she said, and her voice trembled not from fear but from the weight of knowing what she might have to do to keep him alive. Jesse's jaw tightened, but his eyes, those weary, storm-colored eyes, held something beyond fear, something like resignation. "I figured," he said softly. "Briggs never leaves things unfinished." The name itself was a shadow, and Tala felt it crawl into her bones. She had never seen the colonel, but she had heard stories from those who had, a man who punished with precision, who believed that mercy made men weak, and who carried a small silver cross on his chest not for faith, but for memory, each line on it a name of a soldier who deserted. The settlers would not help Jesse. She could feel it in the air, in the way eyes slid away from questions, in the way even her own people looked toward the soldiers with wary calculation. Loyalty, in such times, was not a word but a knife, one that cut both ways. Tala knew she could hide him among the canyons for a few nights, but not forever. She knew, too, that if her tribe discovered the truth, that Jesse had once ridden with the men who burned their kin, they might deliver him to Briggs themselves. And yet when she looked at him, exhausted and unguarded, she saw not the outlaw they hunted, but the man who carved her a moon out of brass and promised her peace under a sky that never keeps its word. She made her choice in silence, pressing her palm to his cheek, whispering in Apache the word for wait, which was also the word for hope. And in that quiet, with the colonel's soldiers setting their campfires a few miles away, she swore to herself that she would keep his secret until the desert itself forced her to break it. The wind shifted west, carrying with it the faint clang of distant metal and the scent of soldiers' tobacco, until her breath caught as if fate had just taken aim. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then. Let's get back on the trail. Under the same sky that first heard his promise, Tala found Jesse where the river bent like a question, the moon laying a pale, clear coin of light across his shoulders. She came with the steady feet of someone who had learned to measure a danger by the way the air tasted, and when she stopped before him the whole canyon seemed to hush as if the land itself expected an accounting. She did not pace or preface, she simply said, "You fought with them," and the words dropped into the night between them like a bone thrown to a dog. His silence filled the space, a confession the desert could hear even when the tongues of men tried to soften what had been done. He looked older in that stillness, as if the weight of other people's pyres had settled into his spine, and the memory came out of him in small, harsh pieces. The march, the orders barked like cold iron, the way smoke folded over children's faces and turned questions into ash. He told her, because his chest could hold the lie no longer, that the day the village burned he could not obey the order, that he turned his horse away and rode until his lungs remembered only the dry taste of dust, and that leaving the line had been both salvation and sentence. Tala's tears came slow and bright, slipping down the planes of her face not from weakness but from the collision of two truths. This man had been near the thing that wounded her people, and he had also, in the same breath, tried to be its refusal. She listened like someone taking in two rivers that run toward one sea, tasting salt from both and deciding how to make shelter. Her voice trembled then, not with the wild heat of accusation but with a quieter, fiercer kind of demand. "Then why did you ride back?" The question was a hawk's stoop, quick and precise, seeking the heart of motive. Jesse's answer was small, like a prayer he had practiced in the dark, "Because you were the only thing left worth facing." The words landed like hammers. They were humble and brazen at once, a man's apology offered as a reason and a vow folded into one. The night held its breath. Around them, the river hissed soft and knowing, the willows leaned like attentive listeners, and the stars, indifferent and ancient, watched the human calculus of guilt and grace play out beneath them. Talia felt the map of her world shift. She thought of kin whose names she had been taught to bear like relic rakes, of songs sung low at funerals, of the way mothers' faces change when they learn a child is gone. And she also felt the immediate, palpable warmth of the man who had carved a crescent from spent metal and given it to her as a piece of himself. She weighed the facts like coins under a palm, the evidence of his past actions, the witness of his present deeds, the testimony of her own heart that beat differently when he was near. Trust, she understood in the marrow of her bones, is not granted like bread but earned by the slow ritual of days. Yet there are moments when the world demands an answer that cannot be postponed. She did not answer him the way the elders might, with law or miracle. Instead, she reached and laid her hand on the pendant at her throat, feeling the indentations his rough hand had left in the soft metal, and in that touch she communicated both the fracture and the cord binding them. "If you lied to me, Jesse Cole," she said in a tone that held both blade and balm, "the land will know. But if you tell me the whole truth, no more half-assed stories, then we choose from what's left." He looked at her as if seeing a country he had not thought he deserved to enter. His eyes shimmered with something like relief and terror braided together. In the silence that followed, the canyon seemed to test them, whether love could be a bridge across burned ground, whether repentance could change the ledger of history. And somewhere beyond the reach of moonlight, men moved in measured steps, preparing to press whatever verdict the world would hand down. Tala's voice, when it came, was low and final as rain. "Then speak, and be ready to live with what you make of it." The river kept talking. The The stars kept their patient watch, and the two of them, bound now by truth, waited to see whether honesty would be the thing that saved them both or the one that finally made the earth demand its due. The night cracked open with a low thunder of hooves, the scouts of Colonel Briggs fanning out across the desert like wolves with orders carved into their bones, and by dawn, their silhouettes were already smudging the far ridges, cutting the land into lines of pursuit. Jesse knew that sound in his blood, knew it the way a hunted animal knows the rhythm of the predator's breath. He had been running since the first fire he refused to start, since the day his conscience disobeyed command. But this time the run carried a different kind of weight because now there was someone he could lose beyond himself. He found Talon near the edge of the canyon, her hands red with clay from shaping pots for the coming season, her eyes full of the stillness that comes before a storm. He told her in broken words what he had heard from the traders. The cavalry was closing in. Briggs himself had sworn to make an example of the deserter who had shamed the regiment, and the way he said it made the air between them hard to breathe. "You have to come with me," he said, the plea tumbling out rough and desperate. "Over the mountains, across the desert, there's a place near Sonora where no one knows my name, where we could start again, live quiet, honest." His voice cracked on honest, and Tala's heart faltered because honesty was the one thing they had fought to build between them. Yet it was also the one thing that demanded she face the truth he wanted to escape. Her mother's cough had deepened into something that sounded like prophecy. The tribe's food stores had thinned to shadows, and she could not abandon her people without tearing a hole into the stories that bound them together. She touched his arm, not to comfort but to anchor. "My mother needs me," she said softly, "and my people are hungry. The land calls me here. You belong to another path." Her voice didn't tremble, but her fingers did. The river wine carried the smell of coming dust, and in that smell Jesse could already sense the end. He dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against her hand, the gesture half prayer, half surrender. "Dala," he whispered, "they'll hang me if they find me. I can't lose you too." She looked down at him, seeing not a fugitive but a man trying to outrun the shadow of his own decisions, and though every part of her ached to follow, she knew that love rooted in flight cannot last the seasons. "Go now," she said, her voice cutting through the night like the thin edge of mercy. "The moon will light your way back, if you're true." The pause before the last words was long enough to fit both blessing and warning. He stared at her as though memorizing her into his bones. The river whispered beside them, carrying silvered fragments of moonlight as if gathering proof of their promise. He wanted to argue, to tell her that duty and love could share the same saddle, but even he didn't believe it. He pressed his lips to the crescent pendant at her throat, the one he'd shaped from the shell of a bullet, and then, wordlessly, unclasped it, setting it in her palm. "Keep it," he said, "so you remember who I wanted to be." The sentence landed with the finality of a prayer half heard by heaven. Before dawn, the horizon caught fire with the first blush of light, and Jesse mounted his horse, its hooves heavy with dread, its mane braided with dust and silence. Tala stood by the riverbank, her figure framed by mist and resolve, watching him disappear toward the west where danger waited like an unburied sin. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, the canyon filled with a stillness so complete it seemed to erase even memory. She closed her fingers around the pendant and felt the faint warmth it still carried from his skin, and as the first rays of sun touched her face, she whispered to the wind in her tongue, "Bring him back clean." But the desert keeps its own counsel. The wind rose, carrying both dust and fate across the open plain, and by the time the day broke fully, all that remained of Jesse Cole were his hoofprints fading into light, and a promise trembling on the air, uncertain as the line between love and the truth it cannot outrun. Weeks stretched across the desert like an endless road with no horizon, each day blurring into the next until time itself began to taste like dust. The sun rose and fell with the same cruel precision, and still no rider came from the west. No figure broke the shimmer of heat on the long line of sky where she had last seen him vanish. Tala's hands had grown thin from work and waiting. Her mother's breath rattled softly in the tent behind her each night, and though the tribe's needs called her in every waking hour, some part of her remained elsewhere, by the river, by the ghost of a promise. Every evening, when the fire sank low and the elders' songs wound into silence, she slipped away to the water's edge with the crescent pendant clutched against her chest, its brass dulled now to the color of old honey, and she watched the moon's slow pilgrimage across the heavens as if it alone could deliver word of him. Some nights it hung whole and bright, filling the canyon with pale gold light that made her believe he was alive, still moving beneath the same sky. Other nights it thinned to a broken shard, and she imagined his body somewhere in the wasteland, cold beneath that same indifferent moon. The wind spoke in half-truths. It carried the distant echo of gunfire, the whisper of riders' talk from passing traders, the kind of stories that travel far but never straight. They said a shootout had taken place near the borderlands. 3 men against 6, one left standing for a moment longer than he should have, and when he fell, the moon had been caught halfway in the dark. They said his horse limped home alone, its saddle torn, its reins soaked in blood. They said the man had no name, just a silver bullet in his pocket shaped like a crescent moon. Talo listened and felt her throat tighten, but she did not weep. She would not give the rumor the satisfaction of becoming truth. No, she whispered to the stars, not yet. Her refusal was more than hope. It was defiance, a rebellion against the logic of distance and death. She told herself the desert could not take a man who had once turned his back on violence, that perhaps he'd found shelter in some far-off valley, nursing his wounds, waiting for the right night to return. Yet faith, when stretched too long across silence, becomes something harder, sharper. It ceases to comfort and begins to carve. Each night she prayed, and each morning the prayer returned unanswered, like an echo trapped between cliffs. Her people began to worry. She moved through the days like a ghost still tethered to her body, her eyes fixed on places no one else could see. Her mother, weak but wise, murmured once, "Child, the moon is a circle. It leaves to remind us it can return." But Tala knew circles too well. She knew they could also be traps, paths that led only back to where sorrow began. The younger woman whispered when she passed, saying her love had turned her heart into stone, that her silence was a bad omen. Still, she went each night to the riverbed, whispering his name into the stillness until even the frogs and crickets fell quiet, as if honoring the persistence of her grief. The moon grew thin again, a sliver over the horizon, and the wind brought a new scent, gun oil, sage, and rain. But no hoofbeats, no voice, no promise renewed. Her faith had become both her chain and her sanctuary. It kept her alive by giving shape to waiting, yet it bound her to a story the world might have already ended. One night, when the moon was at its smallest, she knelt by the water and pressed the pendant into the earth beside her, whispering, "If you're gone, then carry this with you into whatever comes next." But when she opened her hand again, she could not leave it buried. The metal glinted faintly under starlight, and she realized that to let it go would mean admitting the desert had won. So she slipped it back around her neck, rose to her feet, and faced the horizon once more, where the darkness waited, vast and unbroken, holding the shape of her unyielding belief. Colonel Briggs returned like a verdict, his hat scarred by lead and sun, and the way he stood in the settlement made the air lean away from him. He spoke with the clipped authority of a man who has learned to turn rumor into law. And when he said Jesse Cole was dead, buried where buzzards circle, a body left to the ledger of bullets, his words fell like stones that would not be plucked from the river. The town answered in small silences, a blacksmith's hammer held mid-strike, a child's sudden hush, women folding hands as if to hide the tremor in them. Even those who had once offered bread to a stranger found their eyes sliding to the ground. Yet there was something in the colonel's stone that did not fit neatly into the tidy shape of a report. It had the edge of someone accustomed to performing certainty while keeping a private file of doubts, and that shadow, thin as a crack of light, made Tala's skin prickled with a suspicion that did not belong to grief alone. She felt the statement in her bones rather than her ears, the way cold moves through marrow, and for a moment she let the announced death sit like frost, hard and quick to bruise. But grief, she knew, could be both reaction and snare. There are men who speak deaths into being to close a question they would rather not answer, and Briggs's smile, small and dry, carried the taste of that convenience. The elders gathered and murmured. They offered the colonel practiced, careful nods, because they had learned the balance between defiance and ruin. Yet Tali watched Briggs when he looked away, and she saw the way his fingers toyed with the band of his hat, the gentle, almost absent rub that a man gives to a talisman when he is not always sure of what he believes. That shadow of uncertainty lodged itself in Tala the way a splinter lodges beneath skin, irritating, persistent, and impossible to ignore. She remembered the half-moon pendant at her throat and the sound of Jesse's laugh when he first carved it. She remembered his hands, which had learned to be gentle after learning to be hard, and the nights by the river when he spoke of changing himself until the word change felt like a promise he could not yet keep. The colonel left after a day and a night of questions with no more ceremony than he came, and the soldiers rode back toward the rim like men who had closed a file and left an ellipsis. When their dust cleared, Tala stood at the riverbank, the pendant cold at her chest, and the village resumed its rituals with the mechanical patience of people who must eat and mend and bury and rise. But Tala could not let the colonel's words settle as final. There was a hollow in the way they were delivered, a tidy cruelty that felt like a story cut to fit evidence rather than the other way around. So she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would go out and look, not because she distrusted the dead, but because sometimes the dead are not what the loudest voices declare, and because a woman who loved another man would not grant the land the power of an unexamined ending. She wrapped a blanket about her shoulders, hid a small knife at her belt, and under a moon that had watched promises made and broken 100 times before she stepped out of the safe geometry of the camp and into a desert that keeps secrets the way a heart keeps names. The night was a map of faint sounds, an owl, the silver thread of river, the distant scrape of a coyote, and Thala walked with the single-mindedness of someone who had decided to follow a scent of truth even if it led to ruin. She thought of the colonel's hat, its bullet scars, and wondered whether those marks were proof or theater, whether men who carry authority also carry rehearsed endings to justify a life of simple orders. As she crossed the first ridge, she felt the eyes of the village press against her back like hands, and she felt the old, tribal calculus, love versus duty, dealt again and again within her. The desert received her without comment. It offered only footprints and wind ant. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a trail that might be bones or might be the ragged evidence of a man who had merely kept moving. Tala chose to follow, guided by moonlight and the small, stubborn belief that spirits wander for reasons and that sometimes a wandering spirit might still be found and given rest by the living who would refuse to let a needed story stand in for a life. Days and nights braided into a fever that folded Tala inward until the world felt like a painting left too long in the sun, colors running and edges soft. Her feet carried her by habit at first, then by a stubbornness that had the shape of love, and the desert answered her with mirages that took the form of what she wanted most. In the heat of noon she would stop and swear she heard hooves, and in the blue wavering haze a figure would rise beside her, as solid and impossible as a memory, and Jesse's laugh would leak into her ear the way river water slips under a stone, soft and inevitable, and she would turn and reach out because believing needs muscle as much as it needs faith. The hallucinations began like a mercy, a set of tobacco and went where there was none. The distant scrape of leather, a voice so intimated felt like a shadow pressing against her palm, Tala, and the single name would splinter the ache into something manageable. He rode with the patient gentleness he had shown at the river, his shirt sun-bleached, his eyes a little softer than when she'd last seen him, and in that vision he kept saying sorry in 100 small ways, the apologies braided into confessions. I wanted to bring you the moon, but I had nothing but ashes. I wanted to be the man you believed I could be. Each apology arrived like a confession heard in a church empty except for 2 trembling people, and Tala would sit in the sand and let the words roll over her as if the desert itself had become a preacher. But the mind, when stretched thin under sun and fear, stitches together story from grief and rumor, and often what it builds is a house of ghosts. She dreamed of Jesse riding beside her across the plain, hand extended, and in that hallucinated company he spoke of narrow roads and impossible choices, of the weight of orders and the lighter weight of mercy, and every time he said ashes she imagined the embers of more than one burned barn, the smoke of promises that had once been obeyed by men who now slept under flags heavier than their consciences. The visions grew bolder until one afternoon, when the sky had the flat white of something resigned, she fell forward in the heat and slept on the hot slope like a thing unmade, and in that sleep Jesse's voice called her by name so clear she jerked awake thinking she could still feel the pressure of his gun. The landscape around her looked like a place someone had left in a hurry, a scatter of blood-leaf sage, a torn strap, the shadow of a boot print turned too shallow by wind. She rose and moved as if led by the whisper of a path and then stopped because the sand in front of her was disturbed in a way the deliberate wind did not make, a shallow mound, a curve like a hand half closed over the land, and at its center, half buried in grit, was a rifle butt, splintered and dark with a softened stain of old iron. For a moment she stared in a silence that swallowed the rest of the world. Because the desert has a way of telling truths with the bluntness of objects, the ripple stood like punctuation. A sentence ended. Kneeling, her heart punching like a bird trapped in a small cage, Talia brushed sand away with fingers that trembled from sun and fear and something resembling dread, and the motion revealed not only the wood in the old leather strap but the glint of metal, a small crescent, dulled now, the very shape Jessie had given her. A moon turned to a coin of remembrance and half swallowed by the earth. She held it up and it caught the light like a lie made honest by being found. The pendant was warm from the day's sun and still bore the faint groove of his thumb. The sight of it made the air feel thicker, as if the world had paused to let her understand what she had found, and a cold like winter ran through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. The grave was shallow, a human attempt at tidy burial that the desert would have its own way with, and there was no marker except the rifle and the crescent, no name, no prayer, just artifacts in the small, private geometry of her life. For a long time Talia simply listened to the wind because it seemed the only language in which the dead might speak without being claimed by lies. It murmured and carried with it the faint echo of Jessie's apologies, or perhaps it only carried the echo of her own conjuring, and in that blurred place between truth and imagined mercy her body decided a kind of mourning that felt like movement. She wrapped the pendant in her hand and pressed it to her heart. And even as the desert held its breath and the sun began its slow fall toward a horizon that knew the shape of endings, she understood, whether by grief or by a stubborn, sacred logic, that the truth might be a thing both terrible and simple. Either the man she loved lay under the thin heap with a crescent at his side, or he lived somewhere still, wounded and wandering. Either way, the world had shifted, and she would have to name what she found before the wind did. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. The night that Talia had thought carved itself into morning shifted like a card table when a shadow stirred at the edge of the shallow grave and a shape peeled itself out of the dark as if the land were giving something back it had once taken. Jessie rolled up from the sand with the kind of stubbornness that stubborn men are made of, worn, bleeding at the edge of his shirt, eyes rimmed with a desert fever and dust, his mouth pulled into a small, incredulous grin as if surprised at being alive was a new habit. And for a moment Talia could do nothing but stare as the man she had buried with rumor and prayer sat up and laughed a breath that was half sob. He had been left for dead after a skirmish on a salt flat where bullets found bodies like numbers on a ledger. A patrol had ridden past assuming one more corpse was a mercy to the land. Yet he had not died that day. He had crawled, and the crawl had been long and terrible, a negotiation with the sun and thirst and a man's will. And he had learned what the desert would grant only by asking for less than it demanded. When he finally reached the place where the wind carried river scent, where night folded its arms like an old friend, he found Talia bent over the shallow earth, fingers clawing at sand, and for a few heartbeats the world was a single thin sound, the river, distant and patient. "You came back?" she whispered, and the sentence was so small, spoken as if to confirm a miracle, that Jessie's throat worked on a sound that could have been a prayer or a curse. He nodded, trembling in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "I never stopped," he said, the words coming out brittle and raw, each syllable a proof he had kept while moving through hell. They were a promise redeemed and a confession delivered at once. She reached without thinking and took his face in both hands, feeling the grit and the softness of skin that had been brave for a long time. And when she saw the depth of the wounds, old scabs, a new rot of infection, her body, always practical, slid into action. She tore a strip from her skirt to bind a bleeding wrist. She found the tenderness that fear could not withhold and pressed it against bone. For a breath the two of them held something simple and fierce, relief, which is its own kind of sacrament, until the night that had seemed to promise a quiet redemption was rent by the sound of hoofbeats and the sudden flare of torches throwing long, accusing shadows across the desert. The noise arrived like a sentence. Briggs and his riders had followed the track Talia had left and had not been the kind of men to let rumor cool on the other side of a border. Jessie's eyes flicked to the rim where light bloomed and men moved like a tide, and in that instant the fragile sanctuary of reunion shattered into immediate, urgent choices: run, hide, surrender, fight, the old list of human options when law finds heart. Talia looked at him, fury and fear braided in her face, and she realized that her act of following him, of refusing to accept finality, had been both brave and a beacon. She had led soldiers straight to where the living man lay. He tried to stand and the movement buckled him. Courage and injury wrestled and the desert seemed to measure both. "Leave," Jesse whispered, not to her but to the night, as if the word might be a cloak to hide them both. His voice contained both command and plead, the impossible sound of a man who loved enough to want the other to live first. Tala's fingers closed on the crescent at her throat, the metal warm and ridiculous and necessary, and the pendant felt like the center of a compass that no longer had true north. She knew then that choice would not be between two men but between law and love, between a people who might hate them for the past and a future that might never come if they were taken before dawn. The torches edged closer and Colonel Briggs's voice cut across the plain like dry paper, a mix of accusation and ritual, a man certain of order and the meaning of punishment. Jesse's hand went to the pistol at his hip, though he had sworn he would not use it, and Tali thought of the elders' faces, of her mother's cough, of promises made and promises broken, and everything condensed into a single, impossible decision. In the raw light of the torches their reunion became a brief, desperate tableau, a wounded man and the woman who loved him standing where rumor had called them finished, while behind the riders the night waited, a jury ready to deliver its blunt verdict. They ran until breath became a wound, until the desert itself seemed to hold its lungs in sympathy. The canyon opened before them like a cracked rib cage, ribs of red stone arching overhead where moonlight leaked through the seams, and there, in that hollow of silence and grit, Jesse finally collapsed to one knee, his blood dark against the sand, his face ghost pale beneath the half-light. Tala dropped beside him, her hands pressing against the wound on his side that refused to close, whispering words meant for healing, though she knew the desert honored no such prayers. Behind them came the echo of pursuit, hoofs clattering, the clipped bark of orders, Briggs's voice rising and falling with the cadence of a man who believed the law carried God's own signature. Jesse knew they couldn't run any farther. He pulled the revolver from its holster and pressed it into Tala's hands, the metal slick with sweat and regret. "If I fall, don't let them take you," he rasped, each word stitched with a rasp of pain. She stared at the weapon as though it were a stranger, the weight of it alien and cruel in her palm. "No more promises," she said, her voice breaking open but still sharp. "Just truth." Her eyes blazed like firelight, like every woman before her who had watched men make wars of duty and regret and decided that her own courage would speak louder. He tried to smile, but it came out as a shadow. There was nothing left in him but the will to make this one last stand mean something more than survival. The first shot cracked the air, splitting the stillness into fragments. Jesse's hand found the rifle he'd carried from one battle to another, and he fired with the precision of a man whose every shot was a confession, every echo a prayer for forgiveness. The canyon filled with smoke and dust and the metallic taste of war. The moon above a silent witness to the old language of violence humans spoke when love and law collided. Briggs's men fanned out, torches flaring, their light bouncing off the canyon walls in quick, jagged bursts like memories returning too fast. Jesse's bullets found their marks. 2 riders fell before they ever saw his face, and still he moved, slow but steady, a dying rhythm that carried the ghost of the soldier he once was. Tala stayed beside him, reloading when he faltered, her hands shaking not from fear but fury. Every flash of light, every echoing gunshot was another breath stolen from a peace they might have had. Then Briggs stepped forward into the circle of firelight, his face lined not with doubt but something colder, conviction polished to cruelty. "You could have been remembered as a soldier, Cole," he shouted over the gunfire, "but you chose to crawl among the dirt with savages." Jesse, already fading at the edges, looked up at the man and laughed, a broken, tired laugh that carried more truth than any sermon. "Better among them," he said, "than with men who forgot what mercy was." His last bullets sang across the canyon and found Briggs square in the chest. The colonel staggered, eyes wide in disbelief, as if undone not by death but by the realization that justice could wear another man's face. Jesse's victory lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Another gun roared from the dark, and the force of it folded him backward into Tala's arms. She caught him as if she had always been meant to, her hands pressed against his chest where blood blossomed through his shirt like a cruel flower. His breath came shallow, his eyes glassy with pain yet strangely peaceful, finding hers as the world narrowed to the sound of wind and the thudding retreat of surviving horses. "You brought it back," she whispered, her tears falling like rain on his skin. "The moon you promised me." Above them, That same moon hung bright and whole, silvering the dust and blood alike. He tried to speak, but only a soft sound left him, half word, half sigh, the ghost of a promise finally kept. His head tilted toward the light, the last motion of a man who had wandered too long between sin and salvation. And then he was still, his body slackening as if surrendering not to death but to rest. Talent pressed her forehead against his, whispering in her tongue the words for release, her tears painting his face with salt and sorrow. Around them the canyon went quiet, the night reclaiming its breath. The firelight faded to ember, and the wind carried away the smoke, leaving only the soft shimmer of moonlight on stone, and the stillness of a love that had burned through its final dawn. The river took him back like a quiet witness, answering the small, human ceremony with the old patience of water. Tali worked until her palms ached, scooping earth with the practiced rhythm of someone who has buried seasons and songs, and the place where she set Jesse down was the same curve of sand where their hands first met and where moonlight had once promised everything. She wrapped him in a scrap of cloth they had used to patch a saddle, folded his coat the way a mother folds a child's blanket, and when she laid the crescent pendant on his chest, it caught a sliver of dawn and flashed like proof that a promise, however broken, had been returned in the shape it could be. Her hands moved with no ceremony beyond the truth of tending a clean stone at his head, a shallow mound smoothed into a shoulder by the small, stubborn tenderness of grief, and as she worked the river sang in a voice only the land can sing, telling of things older than soldiers' orders and younger than rumor. Dawn came slow and pale, and when light reached the canyon it came as a slow unfastening, like a breath released. Hala sat a long while with her back to the river, the pendant heavy and honest at her fingers, and she let the canyon hold her grief in its vastness so that it would not crack her like thin pottery. She spoke to him then, not to ask for what had been lost but to acknowledge what had passed between them. "You brought it back after all," she whispered, and the words fell into the hollow of the morning and seemed to rearrange the air, as if saying them aloud made the world forgive itself a little. Her voice was small and cracked like old bark, but it split the canyon's quiet. Birds tilted their heads and an old dog somewhere lifted his ears and went back to sleep, and the elders who watched from the rim saw the woman who had once been part of their stead stand at the shore and speak to her buried wish. They would say later that she smiled as she spoke, and perhaps she did, a smile like the breaking of a shell, because the pendant had been returned to the body of the man who promised the moon, and in that return there was a kind of justice that neither law nor war could claim. When the work was done she traced the line of his face with one finger, committing the map of him, scar and laugh line, thumped callous on the small white mark near his jaw, to memory the way a reader learns a favorite verse by heart, and then she rose with the slow dignity of someone who has completed a duty that contained both love and sorrow. The village gathered at a distance as the sun climbed, respectful and wary, and Talia watched the faces of those who had loved and feared the land with the unhurried time of people to understand that grief is a currency paid in different measures. Some brought water, some stood with folded arms, and some turned their eyes away because public mourning can demand too much truth of those who have to keep living. She laid a simple marker at the head of the grave, a flat, unadorned stone, and pressed her palm against it until the skin of her hand warmed and left an impression, as if leaving a trace of touch could anchor memory to the earth. Then she spoke again, not with words but with a small litany of acts. She straightened his coat, wiped a smear of dust from his mouth, and finally, when the light had settled and the river's voice became only a memory in the stones, she covered him with the last layer of sand. For a long time after she sat by the river until the sun pulled itself higher and the world took on the steady noise of daily life. And when she stood at last she slid the crescent pendant over her own head and let it rest at her breast where it had once been his gift. The metal was cool and real against her skin, a relic that now belonged to a story neither fully clean nor entirely damned. Talia walked away from the river without looking back. The alders would tell the tale of that leaving is one of those things that happen when a person becomes part of a place's memory, that she vanished not with a dramatic flight but with the quiet erasure of footprints smoothing into sand, as if the land itself decided her legend should not be shouted but known by hush. People would say later that a dusky pale figure could be seen sometimes by the water, an outline that pauses where river meets bank, fingers touching the surface like a question, or that at certain moons you might find a set of prints leading down to the river, ending without return. The children would whisper the story on cool nights and the elders would nod, because in that country every small grief becomes a teaching and every unaccounted love becomes a kind of law. Tala's silhouette dwindled until she was only a memory upon the ridge, her footprints fading like tears drying on stone, and the river kept the secret of what she carried away, whether it was peace, punishment, or simply the quiet that follows the closing of a book, beneath the same sky that had once held his promise. The land held his body and the moon held the echo, and together they kept watch while the rest of the world went on. Years later, the river kept its old promise of silence and reflection, and those who passed that stretch of land told the same strange, slow story by Heartlight, of a woman in white who walked the bank when the moon rose, her shawl catching the lunar glow so that she looked less like a person and more like a memory come down to stand by the water. Riders swore they saw her pause where the sand curved, fingers trailing along the current as if feeling for something lost, and wagon drivers muttered that their horses shied at her shadow though there was never a breath of wind. The tale spread the way desert rumors do, slow as a river, sharpened by repetition, and with each telling the figure gathered new details until she belonged to the landscape the way a mesa belongs, inevitable and patient. Sometimes she hummed a wordless song that left men thinking of the names of those they had loved and lost. Sometimes she simply stood as if listening for hoofbeats no longer audible to the living, and children were warned not to tease the thing in white because grief, the elders said, is not a thing you prod for sport. Travelers from dusty towns spoke of the way the river's surface glowed silver even on nights when the moon was absent, an odd light that seemed to come from memory itself, and the superstition grew. Perhaps the moon she had been promised had returned and chosen to linger in the water, or perhaps the river kept its own echo of light to honor the bargain between two people who had once tried to bend fate into a small, private grace. Some insisted she waited for him, still waiting for the cowboy who had promised the moon and then gone riding into storms, while others claimed she guarded the place where love and regret had braided together until no one could tell them apart, and either story was useful. One offered the comfort of hope, the other the steadiness of an admonition. At times a lean preacher would say in a low voice that ghosts are simply the part of us that cannot be forgiven, and in that telling the woman in white became a moral, a test for the living to ask whether the heart keeps faith even when the world demands reckoning. Hunters and poachers kept away out of superstition. Lovers left small stones at the river's edge as if making an altar to the stubbornness of loyal sorrow, and the elders, who had watched the whole arc of the thing from the beginning, smiled with the patient cruelty of people who know how stories keep communities whole. In hard seasons, when rain failed and the corn withered, some would say the woman had gone into town to take what was needed and give it to the hungry, a spectral midwife of mercy. Others, crueler, would whisper that she prowled the graves, laying curses into the dirt where promises had been broken so that no man would swear lightly again. The river did not answer the gossip. It only reflected whatever the world leaned over it to see, and on windless nights it kept a clear, bright face that made the illusions plausible and prayers seemed like instructions. Tales changed with each telling until Tala, if that was indeed her name, was both less and more than a woman, a talisman against forgetting, a cautionary image for those who would choose love over duty, a soft voice that taught children the shape of mourning. When strangers tried to take a scrap of her story as a joke, the elders only looked at them long enough for the light to shift and then return to their knitting. In that long, careful glance was the unspoken claim that some griefs are not to be trifled with. And so the place became a mark on the map that travelers used to test their courage. Cross the river at dusk and you will see her, say the locals, or you will pass a quieter life by without knowing what you missed. People preferred the versions that fit their comfort. Some wanted the romantic end in which she waits until his return, others the grimmer moral. But everyone agreed on one detail that never changed. The river kept to its silver, even when the moon was gone, and the light there was not the light of any lamp or lantern but something that felt like memory made visible. In that light the canyon told its own liturgy, teaching new generations that promises leave marks on the land, and that when a vow is made under stars that have watched longer than any man, the earth remembers it longer than the people who made it. Thus a woman in white joined the country's slow languages of warning and wonder, her story folded into the map, so that anyone who came seeking the shape of heartache and the cost of mercy could find, at the riverbed, a soft, steady answer waiting beneath the desert sky. They say the desert keeps its promises the same way it keeps its bones, buried beneath sun and silence until some wind or some restless heart unearths them. And maybe that's the truest kind of memory there is, not tied to your kind, but patient enough to wait until someone remembers how to ask, Tonight, with the canyon cooled and the moon sliding its pale hand along the river, I imagine Thala's figure still there at the water's edge, the crescent pendant at her breast catching light like a small, stubborn truth. And I imagine the land listening, taking in the soft litany of her steps and the heavier rhythm of the man she loves. Because promises leave prints the way hoofs leave hollows, and those hollows fill with stories. Think of the way love in the old country of wind and stone is not only a private thing but a public debt, a vow made beneath stars that have watched human hearts for longer than any ledger, a vow that asks the land to be witness, and the land answers in weather and in the slow accumulation of small changes, an extra tuft of grass where someone once knelt, a worn patch of sand where a hand smoothed a face, a quiet place on the bank where children dare to whisper the names of people the grown ones pretend to forget. Promise is a kind of weight. It demands an accounting even when the accountants are gone. And I have stood where Tala stood and seen the way a single object, a pendant, a hat, a broken spade, collects meaning until it is more than metal or leather and becomes a compass that points to loss. We tell these stories because we are always trying to teach ourselves how to hold contradictions, that a man can be a once cruel and merciful, that a deed can steal and save, that a woman's choice can both bind a tribe and free a heart. The frontier teaches slow morals in the clatter of wagon wheels and the hush after a gunshot, and it keeps its lessons in ways more stubborn than law. In the quiet after Jesse's breath went still, the canyon did not close up like a wound. It kept a seam open for years, and people who walked by felt the draft, felt the rumor of warmth or a chill depending on what each carried inside. Is not that the way with our own promises, those we make to children, to lovers, to ourselves? Do they not leave a hollow in us that the years will either fill with work and care or let sit like a stone that grows moss? Tala buried a man and carried back a pendant. She buried an ending and carried forward a legend. Somewhere between action and telling, the tale changed into a mirror for anyone who crosses that river. Are you a keeper of vows or a vendor of easy words? We prefer tidy endings, bodies returned, justice served, grief contained, and yet life in the dust rarely obliges the tidy. It asks instead that we breathe with what is left and make something like meaning out of shrapnel. So what do we do with the promises we have made that became heavier than the hands that forged them? Some we honor quietly, every day, intending and in the small repetitions of care. Some we forget, because forgetting is a kind of mercy for a world that cannot bear every debt. Some we lip turn into cautionary tales to be told at campfires so the next generation learns to weigh a vow before the making. Tala's story is one of those ways. It is both a soft lament and a hard lesson, teaching that love without reckoning can be a blessing or a weapon, that courage sometimes means staying and sometimes means leaving, and that the land itself is the slow ledger that neither pardons nor forgives without witness. Now, lean closer, listener. This is where the story stops being only theirs and becomes, if you let it be, yours. The moon is nearly full. The river is a band of silver that will not forget light it has once been given. The last thing Tala did, in the telling that never quite settles, was to leave the pendant where it was needed and walk away until she became a whisper, a caution, a hymn, maybe to protect the living from the cost of her choices, maybe because she herself needed a place where echoes could keep company with memory. We walk among ghosts whose names we have spoken and whose debts we have not yet paid. So tell me, stranger, because stories ask answers back and the night is patient. What promise have you buried beneath your own desert sky? And are you tending it, forgetting it, or leaving it to be found by someone brave enough to dig? If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.